Hey everyone, it's the Shawn. Welcome to another edition of the Women Business Leaders Show, where myself and my co-host Lea Woodfood of Smart Femme Magazine meet with leading women from around the world to see what's happening, what's going on, what they've used to drive their success, lessons for you and your success, and also pull themes that can help women globally to do more of what they want to do in the business world. Maya Middlemiss today is joining us from London, and she works with people on storytelling. This is obviously a very important skill for those of us that are in the speaking world. Leah and myself do a fair number of speeches, and I know a lot of you do as well, but it's also an important skill when you're trying to get investors or grow your business. And Maya works a lot in the tech space with kind of the emerging companies, the newer companies, and we'll get into all of that in just a moment. For those of you who don't know me as well, I'm the Shawn. I'm a corporate lawyer by training. I help people with stuff related to ownership and control of their business, and I'm always looking to the future of business, and that's where this show comes in. We're looking at really what the future of women in business are, what we can start doing now to be more impactful in the future and to work together between the genders. We do a quick reminder, we do not do investment advice or legal advice on the show. For all of that, consult your own professional advisors. Everything here is just for your education. But we want to jump into a little bit today. And before we do that, I want you to encourage you to comment below, whether you're watching this live or watching it after the fact. Drop your comments. We will read them. We'll respond to them. We're looking for upcoming guests. We're looking for themes and ideas and different things that you're dealing with. And we may respond back to you and help you with whatever issues you have. So we definitely want to hear your comments wherever you're watching it, whether it's the Women Business Leaders YouTube channel, one of our LinkedIn feeds, or on Facebook. And with that, welcome to the show, Maya. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here. Hi, Leah. Hi, Shawn.
Yes, and I know despite the time zones, we got this together here. We've got 3 different time zones. We've got Arizona time, we've got Eastern time, and we've got London time all brought together.
I'm actually in Europe. I'm from London, but I'm taking advantage of being part of the flexible future. I live in Mediterranean Spain, but
okay.
It's a whole other hour away from the US, I think.
Additional hour out there. Okay, perfect. So, Maya, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with people? You know, I know you do a lot of storytelling. You help businesses build their story and really get that out into the community, right?
Yeah, I'm a storyteller by trade, and I've done that in lots of different contexts over the years, whether in terms of journalism or copywriting, content marketing. I've always used words. It's great that now I'm using more video and audio in my work, but it's the same principles that are involved all along. And I've always loved working with technology companies because I've always been excited about the future.
Yep.
And there are some amazing things going on in the world right now. I love bringing that alive for people who are going to be affected by it, whether they know it or not, in ways that they may or may not appreciate, ways that they may or may not like, but we all have a stake in the future. We need to know what's going to be happening. I think the future's never been more fragmented and unevenly distributed, as the cliche has it. So I think there's potential for great things to happen. There's potential for less than great things to happen. We all have an interest in understanding it better. And I think a lot of the clients we work with, some of the most visionary people creating and engineering, are not always the best at explaining that to non-technical audiences. I'm being very diplomatic here.
Yes, you are.
Some of the brightest people in the world, it's just they're fantastic, but they're all in their heads. Whereas the work they're doing is going to have such an impact that it's a privilege to be bringing it to the world in any context.
Yeah, it's quite a gap to bridge, right? I think this is something that's universal, whether you're tech or not tech. You know, as a speaker or as an expert, you know, and I came into speaking as an attorney first. I practiced for many years as an attorney, then started coming into speaking more and more frequently. One of the hardest things is to bridge that gap, right? I mean, you don't want to talk down to your audience, but you also want to bring them up to speed on all the various issues without going over top their heads. So it's a very tricky balance for a lot of speakers, right?
And you lose people if you're overly technical. It's very easy to get boring. I think that's why I've been experimenting more with podcasting and video just in the last year or so, because sometimes to actually write about something that's really technical and in depth, you get to the end of it and think, I'm really pleased with that, but is anyone going to get to the end? So to create different forms of content and infographics and work with people who are better at the more visual side of things, which isn't really me. But we have to lead people in to content in different ways. Just try and use lots of examples and metaphors and relate to things that are happening in people's lives now to try and help them understand and project into that unknown stuff that's all out there in the future.
Yeah. Leah?
Well, don't you think it's been my experience, being in the broadcast news and having television shows, that people really connect with stories. They may not really remember all the details, but they will connect with the stories, and that will bring it top of mind. And that's why I liked what you were doing. As a filmmaker, I love it, because that's what I am. I'm a storyteller.
Well, we're story-driven animals, I think, is very primal. I think we look back to, I don't know, our Neanderthal ancestors or something. They had to make sense of a world that changed with the seasons and things like that. And they had to remember that things happened in sequence. And, there were little plants and then they became big ones you could eat and things like that. Or that animal makes a noise and you can chase it or run away from it. And you had to learn a sequence of events and hang things on that. So I think that's why we look for stories. We crave them as children, and we can relate to them throughout our lives. And for a long time, our whole history was told through stories when we only had oral transmission of what was happening, of our whole history. So it's very much a part of us, I think.
Yeah, a lot of people say it's very biological.
Yeah.
It is, but do you think that the art of storytelling is lost, Maya?
Oh, I hope not. I think there's still a hunger for stories.
I think so too.
Even children, my children are a bit older now, so they didn't get their hands on iPads and things until they were past the sort of very young age.
Right.
They sort of can't get their hands off them now, but they, but even then they still enjoy sort of narrative TV, and so even if some of it's trashy, at least it's storied, and I can see that's the way that they learn. I think there's definitely worrying stuff going on with human attention spans generally, and how we consume information and how we sort of skim over things and dip in and out of things in a way that's not always healthy. And I hope that we'll always have books and we'll always have in-depth content, whether that's film or reading or anything else, just something to hold 100% of people's attention long term. It's a challenge, certainly, for all of us creating content in this world of really kind of dizzy and floating attention. We have to make more effort to grab people's attention and hold it right to the end of the message we want to communicate.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, Maya, I'd like you to talk a little bit about it. Our theme of the show is about women in business and women business leadership. You're in a world with technology where, I know there's a lot of great women out there doing great things in tech space, and we run into them as we work through projects, but this tends to be perhaps, still a disproportionately male industry, percentage wise. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with being in a world where you're helping people add skills, but you're somewhat in the minority? There's not as many women as men.
Yeah, we're a bit of a cliche, really, being a communications agency, and all the directors are female. And we're working with a lot of our clients are male, disproportionately so. There are also lots of women doing amazing work in blockchain and emergent tech, and we try and amplify their stories and network with them wherever we can, whether that's professionally or just part of our general networks, because we want to promote those voices and ensure balance. Like in my podcast, The Crypto Confidence Show, we have a target of at least 60% female guests, which we've maintained throughout the year. Because I think women tell great stories. Men do too, but I want to try and redress the balance that we see in other media. It is improving. There are some amazing projects which are female-led, female-funded, but you also hear some dreadful stories of discrimination, really archaic behavior. Neither finance or tech, at which two worlds blockchain and crypto has emerged, has a great record for being particularly diverse or forward-thinking in terms of minority access and inclusiveness. So we have got a long way to go, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to go. But I think you do make a point. The newer tech seems to be a little more open, right? Or a little more gender balanced.
Well, anything that's new, you can kind of try and shape it as you go along. And I think hopefully the dialogue is improving. I remember at the Malta Blockchain Summit last year, talking to somebody in the queue for the loo. And she said, The last crypto conference I went to, there was no queue for the ladies.
Okay. Yep.
I just walked straight in. Where she was actually saying what a good thing that was, that there were enough women at this event that we actually had to wait a few minutes and network in the ladies' room.
Yeah.
It was a little bit weird, but
right?
it's nothing to celebrate, but it was good to call it out. But that was something she'd noticed improving over the last couple of years. So we're getting there.
Yeah, and I think, Leah, you've seen in your work some of this shift going on as well, right?
Well, and way before I started SmartFem, I was in the software world.
Right.
So it was a very male-dominated profession. And even the younger engineers coming up the ranks, this is in the 90s, again, very Google-ish. You know, I mean, I would be in my little Ally McBeal suit, and, you know, the engineers I'm talking to are in T-shirts and flip-flops, playing foosball. So I've seen a really radical change from corporate America into a much more loosely structured, but I have seen over the years women coming into tech more. You know, when I was there, nobody was there. You know, very few women engineers, and definitely nobody in sales.
Yeah.
But it's getting back, and I'm seeing more women at the helm now, and that really excites me.
I don't want to sort of fall back on stereotypes and cliches, but I think a lot of the women, like female founders that we network with now, there is a sense of helping each other out, looking out for each other, calling out bad practice collectively when somebody's discriminated against. I got into a great ruck on LinkedIn the other day with somebody speaking to an experience they'd had with an investors meeting, and where they were just overlooked basically because of their gender and their religion, quite possibly. And it, you know, these things still go on, but if we can identify them, point to them and say, this is not okay, we can keep moving things towards a more level playing field. We do have a long way to go, but it is improving. And I think there's hopefully a greater willingness to stand up.
I have a question for you, Maya. I had a wonderful conversation with a female engineer who was obviously in the tech space, but she said the gender bias for women really in tech was the fact that once they had a baby, they had to start at the bottom again. And I was wondering if you've seen that.
Well,
they don't keep their position open.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trouble is this space, particularly the blockchain world, which I know best, is so fast moving. When you take a fortnight's vacation, you could find yourself professionally out of the loop. Then to take maternity leave or any kind of break, I could well imagine it would be really difficult to get back from that. And that's something that is going to affect women disproportionately, inevitably. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Obviously, it's always been a factor for women in the workplace everywhere. But when you work in a field that's changing so rapidly, it's much harder to keep up. You have to be on top of it.
We've also seen a similar statement in the structured industries. You know, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm also have a CPA license. So I've seen both the legal world and the accounting world. And there, you know, things are particularly in the larger organizations, very lockstep by class year, right? What year did you start working and how'd you move? And a lot of times the female attorneys, if they take maternity leave or do family care or whatever, they'll just get bumped down a class, and they're like, well, you didn't really lose any progress. You know, you just took a year off and you moved back a class. But what we're finding is that disconnects women from their social connections. They no longer have the same classmates, and they really do lose a lot more than just 1 year.
Yeah, there's a big sense of being held back by that. And really, that's something that we ought to be tackling and changing, because nowadays you can learn anything from anywhere. You don't have to be staying in full-time practice to keep up with the latest in law or technology or medicine. We have access to information on probably half a dozen devices in our own homes. Sure. If we acknowledge that people can and will put in the time to keep themselves professionally updated, and they need to actually do that. You know, people do need to maintain their professional skills if they're practicing professionally and offering an indemnified service off the back of it. That's fair enough. But I think to say that it's automatic that, oh, well, you took a year off to do parenting, that means you're held back, that's simply not excusable anymore. People should be able to test out of that and demonstrate that they've maintained their professional capabilities to the level that their colleagues have who didn't take that time out.
Yeah, and there's some people making the argument, and I think there's a very strong argument that these are not your traditional skills, but some of the alternate skills you pick up from taking a year off to run the household or to raise a kid actually are more valuable in the long term, perhaps, than 1 year of just additional doing the same profession.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even doing more wacky things like traveling or whatever. I mean, maybe if we start to actually acknowledge the value of some of those life skills that you gain outside of a very traditional career path, that will encourage people to take breaks at different points in their career, take sabbaticals, take a year to travel and keep working part-time. It'll encourage more fathers to take parental leave. There's a big disconnect. Certainly in Europe, there are a lot of legal rights to parental leave for fathers, but the uptake of it is still nowhere near what it should be, which means that as a society, it's still not being seen as an equal role, and it's still being seen as detrimental to somebody's professional career.
Yeah. You bring up an interesting point now, and I want to kind of dive into this a little bit. It's sensitive. You talked about not stereotyping before. We've kind of talked about how the genders are treated differently. One of the big themes in my TEDx talk is I looked at a lot of statistical studies because I didn't want to be the guy that was up there just saying, men do this and women do this. But if you put men and women in situations, they often will behave differently, right? If you take a group of 100 men and give them a test, you give 100 women the same test, and you look at the percentage outcomes, women tend to work very collectively. They tend to communicate more among themselves. They'll tend to take the group outcome for compensation versus their individual compensation. These types of things have come out of research studies. The question I think about a lot is, in light of this, moving into the business world, how do we embrace these differences in the genders? And the second part of that question is, what does this mean for the future? I think as the future of business moves forward, kind of these soft skills, the ones you and we just talked about, what do they mean for the future and women in business?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think to go to your first point, yes, men and women are biologically different. Some of those differences are obvious. Some of them are more subtle. The extent to which they are also socially constructed is a source of ongoing debate. And also how much is simply down to our gene expression and what we do and what we use versus lose. I think obviously boys and girls are born differently, but then they're treated differently from day one. From minute one in the hospital and so on. So all of those factors affect which sides of their natural genetic heritage they express and develop and use. So I think that's the first thing to say. I'm not suggesting that that's ever going to change, but I think maybe we are coming to a point as a society where there is more acceptance there's certainly more acceptance of gender fluidity generally, and less tightly defined roles at all life stages, and maybe less stereotyping behavior from infancy will lead to a more balanced expression of human capabilities and attributes as adults in future generations. I don't know, we're not there yet.
Yeah. No, we're definitely, I think we're having a couple of roadblocks with our current administration on that. But
good luck with that. I'm a Brit in Europe. I can't say anything.
Now, I have a question for you too, because I've noticed, having worked in the corporate world and then also worked in the technical world. In the corporate world, I have seen women suppress themselves and suppress each other and allow men to suppress them. But it feels like in the tech world, because there's so few of them, there seems to be a more cohesive and they seem to support each other more so because there's not so many of them.
Yes. I think, I've never kind of identified it as clearly as that before, but I don't disagree. I think probably women have been battling in corporate culture for longer, and they've been battling with more traditional hierarchies and structures. A lot of the tech world, whilst it's very far from diverse, and I don't mean that just in terms of gender, but in terms of age and race and everything else, it can be very non-diverse, but there is on top of that a layer of more collaborativeness and agility and self-organizing and so on, which tends to come with that world, which might be easier for women or anybody who feels that they're in a minority to try and engage with, rather than feeling they're starting at the bottom of a complex hierarchy. And, you know, sad to say that some women may have managed to claw their way up that hierarchy by adopting the skills that disadvantage them and the mindsets and the behaviors, you know, rather than trying to change it.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not judging anybody for what they've done to advance their own careers, but I have seen exactly what you've seen, that women don't always look out for other women, don't always lean in, don't always look back and see who they can help. I think that everybody has the capacity to do that, and there are networks that are growing up, say within big tech organizations and so on, to help people advance through their careers and get mentorship from people who've gone before them. But some people have to go first, and maybe they don't have those advantages.
Yeah.
I've seen the tech world, women in tech send the ladder back down a lot more than the women in corporate America.
That's,
One interesting theme that's just kind of popped out of here from my observation, I'd love to get both of your comments on this, you know, is, you know, the corporate world, a lot of the attempts to create opportunity for women at all have been very structured, right? So, you know, we're going to create an initiative, we're going to appoint a woman to set up initiative to advance other women, and it's very formalistic. What I've seen in the tech world is women coming together and saying, hey, we're going to work together and we're going to change the culture here, and we're going to create we're going to create an opportunity environment. And it's more of a community-based effort, right? It's women in different parts of the tech world all coming together saying, we're going to create opportunity, you know, we're going to create the right culture here. It's just kind of a different flavor of how the movement starts. What do you all think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like I said, I've worked in both sectors, and I was thrilled when I was in the software field and saw a woman in engineering, or just a woman in tech at all, because back in the 90s, there were so few of them. And there was a sense of, oh my gosh, I'm really glad to see you. You know, it was more welcoming, and there wasn't competition because there weren't enough of them to be competing for certain things.
And if there's less hierarchy generally in an environment, it's much easier for people to connect, to network, to reach out to other people outside of their immediate team or organization. Certainly within the tech world, there's an awful lot of industry-wide networking. There's an awful lot of quite short-term kind of product-based or project-based cycles of working, which means that people can come into contact with a lot of different people in their network, either virtually or face-to-face. They can use the technology to stay in touch, to connect with each other's work that they're doing outside of the work they're doing together. There's a lot of general flexibility and fluidity, which I think is yet to come to the corporate world, if it ever will. I mean, the technology will, and other things will, but you know, we're talking about generations of reform that's needed potentially there.
Yeah. Well, I've taken a position in some of my work that, you know, our current organizations, the big ones anyway, were designed by men 100, 150 years ago. Our structures, our top-down hierarchies, that was all built by men. And of course, now you're sticking women into a game that was built by men and saying, hey, you know, let's see how you do, right? And
those 100-year-old men
it's a rigged game. You know, you're asking a soccer player to play American football or vice versa. You know, if you didn't set the playing field up fairly to begin with, it becomes very difficult.
Yes, and it's hard to come in and change the rules of the game in mid-play. You know, you have to tweak things gently and test things out. Again, in an industry sector focused on innovation generally, that's easier, definitely, to be able to say to people, can we try this? Particularly in the software world and the agile world, it's very much a case of test it and see, make a small change, evaluate it. It's much easier.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I agree. If it's not a big, clunky corporation, you can actually maneuver, and it's smaller teams, you can actually maneuver very quickly, and you don't have to make decisions based on committee. Where, you know, I mean, we saw it with Motorola. You know, it was just a really big organization that just couldn't make the shift like some of the other companies. And that, you know, that's just kind of what happens. Intel made the shift. Motorola didn't. You know, we've seen it and even the cellular companies. you
Yeah,
know?
and a lot of the problems happen obviously when something's successful and has to scale really quickly. There's a sort of victim of own success paradigm, but it's true. I think when there's that startup energy and vision and everybody's very close to the founders and what they're trying to accomplish, and then they're really successful, and then they have to hire like mad, and then suddenly they reach a point where the founders aren't in direct contact with all the members of the team, and other people are hiring people to hire people. And the culture can change very quickly then, and very obliviously, because people are so driven by what they're trying to build and fulfill, which is the reason for the expansion. But if there's not careful attention paid to things like culture, to things like marketing communications, that's the time that things can go really skew with the messaging, if there's not a very clear foundation, whether I've written it on.
Uber.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
Uber comes to mind. I mean, bad culture, great idea. Lyft came in and took their concept and made it better and had a much better culture.
Yeah, and you can't run it like a startup sort of bunch of lads anymore. It just doesn't scale. So they pivoted and got it back on track. It could have completely self-destructed. Yep. So fair play.
Well, Maya, it's been fascinating. Your core skills, what you're doing with your clients, shines through. I mean, the way you engage, the way you tell story, the way you communicate is amazing. Why don't you tell folks a little more about what you do, how they can get a hold of you? If there's somebody out there, you understand the tech world, you understand what people need to do to communicate. If somebody wants to work with you or check out your work, how would they find you?
They can find me on Twitter. I'm Maya Middlemiss. I'm also at BlockSparks, where we share a lot of the stuff that we write. We work with clients. Our website is blocksparks.io, so you can find us there. We also run the Crypto Confidence podcast, which is all about making very consumer-focused, non-geeky content around cryptocurrency and blockchain, because for me that's been the most exciting challenges, of something to demystify that's going to cause such a fundamental change that I really needed to explain it to my mum level. Yep. So that's where I started from. Then I realized my mum doesn't listen to podcasts, but we're finding our tone and our voice all the time, and she has listened to it once or twice now, and sometimes she said, yeah, I'm starting to understand that now. So I think want to be that bridge between my mum and the corporate people and the tech people and everybody else. They need to understand each other as the world's fast moving.
That's my applause to you. I mean, that's one of my goals on my Future Done Right show, is to get people talking about future technology in ways that they understand, because, so much of what out there is just super technical. It doesn't make sense. People get overwhelmed very quickly and they glaze over.
We talked a lot about exclusion, and it does exclude people if you message inaccessibly. I think it's very easy for people to get left behind, whether because of language or generation or anything else.
Yeah, well, things like blockchain. I mean, it's fundamental technology that has great applications, but most of the tutorials I see on blockchain start talking about hashtags and encoding, and most people just turn it off because they're like, I don't even understand what they're talking about.
Right.
What's it going to do for me? What's it going to do for you? How might it affect our lives in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? We don't know. We haven't got a crystal ball, but we can look at what's going on now, what's being built, what's being funded, what's being talked about, try and extrapolate that based on what's around us. I haven't got a crystal ball, but I do try and keep an eye on trends and look at what the cutting edge is, and then try and see what that might mean for the normal to come.
Right. Well, fantastic. We're so glad you could join us, Maya. To our audience members, take a moment, pat yourself on the back. I always like to thank you for investing in yourself, investing in the future, and really thinking about these big things. And, working together, we're going to create more opportunity for women in business, and we're going to create a brighter future for men and women working together. I want to remind you, you can check out our past episodes, see our upcoming episodes, all at futureofwomeninbusiness.com. Long URL, but exactly what we're about, futureofwomeninbusiness.com. Check that out. You also get on our mailing list over there. Maya, would love to keep in touch, see you back here on the show again, maybe even get you on the Future Done Right show at some point and talk about the future.
Great. Yeah. Really enjoy that.
Smart Fem magazine.
Yes.
Yeah,
Leah would probably love to get some contributions for our magazine. We can talk about that online.
Fantastic.
Guys, we mentioned it, Smart Fem magazine, great resources for women in business too. Go check that out. So folks, we'll see you all again for a future episode of the Women Business Leaders Show. And I'm looking forward to talking to you all again soon.
Bye, Shawn.
Bye.
Bye, Maya.